Hello, my name is Gina Tucker. I'm a senior compliance consultant with JAF Consulting in the United States, and I'm delighted to speak with you today regarding how to develop and implement an overall master validation program for an organization and discuss the potential complexities that may accompany the effort. Today, we will be discussing several key elements regarding the implementation of a master validation program within an organization. We will examine topics such as why an MVP is needed, looking at why it's important to have one, and if it's required by a regulation. What is a master validation program and what it might include? What are the associated complexities with implementing a program of this nature within your organization? We will look at who is responsible for the MVP, not only for its development, but also for its management, continuous update, and implementation. And we will also examine how an MVP is actually implemented in the organization and what rollout might look like at your company. The GLP regulations tell us that our methods need to be in writing. The regulations also tell us that we need to have procedures for our equipment, including testing and standardization. For purposes of the GLPs, computerized systems fall under that regulatory section in the GLPs. There's no specific FDA or quality system regulation requirement to have an MVP, but it is strongly encouraged. You'll be lost if you don't have one and if you don't use one. Our procedures are intended to drive the conduct of our actions and efforts on a GLP study. Procedures also help us to drive consistency in our work output. By standardizing a practice and expecting all actions to be performed in the same manner, we're building quality and integrity and consistency into that effort. Furthermore, our SOPs provide our clients, our sponsors, and our national monitoring authorities with a written accounting of our methods and serve as the basis for which we can complete verification activities. An MVP is a documented plan that describes the policy, philosophy, strategy, and/or methodology for validating a site, a process, or a product, in our case, a computerized system. The plan can be used as an executive summary within the company or to introduce new personnel to a validation project. It may also include schedules, priority status, responsible individuals, and a project description. In certain circumstances, it may also include any newly developed or acquired products or related processes that must be addressed and documented as part of a potential design control process. It may also include changes to existing products or processes, as well as existing processes or products that are not yet validated or which may be subject to revalidation. Master planning actually began within the industry as a way of organizing thoughts and controlling costs. At the time, validation costs were running potentially as high as, I would say, approximately 13% of the total cost of an installed project. But today, through the implementation of validation programs and robust training measures and stakeholder acceptance, validation makes up approximately 8% of a project's budget. So you can see by introducing consistency and efficiencies into the program, we're able to reduce cost overall. We will review several slides today that discuss processes, SOPs, and questions to consider. Please do keep in mind that as we review these items, that the validation program is much larger than simply the process. It's the sum of all of the parts, if you will. The program is the collection and management of individual components that make up the overall effort. You'll need organization agreement for its development. You'll also need to be cognizant of all of the regulations that you're working within and are required to comply with. And it involves people, our greatest asset in an organization. And in cases where you may fall short of meeting the expectations of either people, process, or regulation, You'll need to be able to provide documented justification and a rationale explaining why and how you're going to overcome those shortfalls. A master validation program is a document or a methodology which describes procedures an organization will follow, and the required deliverables or documents such as plans or requirements or test scripts or the evidence of testing that together will demonstrate that a computerized system is suitable for use in a regulated environment. The document, much like our other documents within the GLPs, must be approved by management and then obviously followed. The MVP should be detailed enough to describe your process and deliverables for all types of systems, from a highly complex system or highly complex configurable or bespoke system to a less complex system, and then anything in between. It may help to consider the MVP as a recipe. If you were cooking a meal using a recipe, you'd want that recipe to tell you all of the ingredients that you'll need before you start the recipe. You'd want that recipe to tell you what temperature to cook your meal at and any different types of cooking equipment that you might need. Specialized pots or pans, perhaps you need an oven or even a barbecue grill. You'd want that document, that recipe, to tell you how to successfully and completely cook that meal so that you'd be able to enjoy it. An MVP is very similar. It should tell you everything that you need to guide your colleagues and your users in demonstrating that a system is suitable for use. So for the purposes of an MVP, your recipe or your program will include things like roles and responsibilities of personnel. And that's to give guidance on the number of resources that will be needed and involved and what their expected duties will be. And that will be helpful for management and for management's planning. Management will use that information to determine how many personnel will be necessary to devote to a particular validation project and for how long, as well as what those individuals' duties and responsibilities will be for the ongoing management of that system throughout its life cycle. We'll also touch on sequence of events to ensure that the documents and steps that are performed in the correct order, which can be especially helpful when describing how and when testing is conducted and in what order your validation deliverables should be created, and the individual deliverables in and of themselves. And this is important to advise on what documents are required to be prepared, what should be included in their contents, including acceptance criteria. How do you know that the system has met the predetermined qualifications and specifications and attributes? One of the tenements of the GLP regulations is that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. So having a detailed list of all of the required documents in your master validation program or your MVP methodology is critical. As we discuss how to develop and implement a master validation program throughout our time together today, we are going to examine the topic in the context of a non-clinical or GLP organization that experienced some challenges with their existing validation program and how they were able to successfully implement a more robust program. In this case study, a GLP company was expanding briskly and bringing new laboratories and services online within a target of approximately 120 days. Based on the proposed new services being offered, clients began placing work with an expected start date of right after that 120 days, so fairly soon thereafter. As you can imagine, new systems were required and purchased and had arrived, but had not yet undergone validation. The challenge with this company was that the personnel at the company were fairly new and did not have experience in validation. The existing SOP at the company described the master validation program, but it wasn't very detailed and it didn't provide enough instruction on what was required for a validation, to support a validation program for an organization, or even how to start. The SOP was written by previous employees that worked at the laboratory who had extensive experience in validation. However, those employees and those individuals were no longer able to participate in the process. As a result, management at the company scheduled meetings to discuss how to proceed. Through our time together today, we will work through how they were able to implement a meaningful and adequate program. FDA expects to see some forethought with regards to your whole validation approach. A well-developed plan will provide FDA and your team members with a total picture of your facility. It is important not to get extremely detailed, but it is important to give an overall general approach or outline that will give your team members and colleagues enough instruction to get the job done. Organizations are expected to demonstrate control of the processes and systems that affect data integrity, product quality, and patient safety. The organization's decision-making process, or on both an organizational and system-specific level, should be documented. We will want to define validation methods or activities, including things like periodic review and change control. Periodic review simply means a formal process for reviewing your systems to ensure that they are being maintained in a validated state. And change control is simply a means to documenting changes and the associated impacts to a system in a controlled way. We will talk more about both of these items in greater detail in a few slides. Your MVP should describe how you go about identifying and tracking all of your computerized systems, in other words, how you inventory them. We will also talk about this in greater detail in a few slides. We will talk about risk assessment in another slide, but in a nutshell, we want to be able to determine the risk factors associated with each system, in part, like a module or a function, or in whole, in the event that the system might fail. We hope it doesn't fail, but we want to make sure that we're prepared with a process in the event that it does. These risk factors should include the regulatory impact, safety concerns, and business concerns, including cost, time, and human resources. And by human resources, we mean people, we mean our team members, our users, our subject matter experts. We want to be able to also identify systems that require validation based on all applicable risk factors that we're able to anticipate. Regulatory impact may include the integrity of regulated data, security, product quality, and focus. We'll want to consider the current regulatory expectations for validating such a system. Safety concerns include consumer safety and environmental hazards. You may or may not, depending on your system, have safety concerns, but if you do, it is something to take into consideration. Business concerns also include company reliance on the system, the establishment of contingency plans, and protection of assets. Additional factors which you may want to include might be the complexity of the hardware, the application, the system software configuration management, the increase in the resources, the number or the skill level of the personnel resources that will need to be focused or dedicated to working on the validation, increased regulatory inspector awareness, and any new or pending regulations, including guidance documents or advisory documents, such as 21 CFR Part 11 or OECD. We'll want to make sure that we document the assessment process and prioritization sequence, including justifications for systems that do not require validation. Understanding the endpoint for an MVP is key also. Validation isn't truly completed. Even when a system is retired, there is still the migration of data, archival, and retention of not only documentation, but data throughout the record retention period that's outlined in the regulations. When drafting your MVP, it can be helpful to use external resources as a basis for developing your program. There are a number of external resources available to you that you can use, such as the FDA 21 CFR Part 11 regulation, the DIA Red Apple 2 document, ISPE's GAMP 5 guidance, and the OECD number 17 advisory document on computer system validation. You can choose to use these references as inspiration for your program, or you can take elements of the various references and create your own bespoke process. The main goal is to ensure that your process is complete and reconstructible and addresses all of the requirements of your national monitoring authority. When drafting, you may want to consider keeping your MVP to a single SOP, or you can spread it across multiple SOPs, perhaps to cover individual deliverable concepts in a very detailed fashion, or break it down into specific areas. Both options are acceptable, and the determination of which path you take will be individual to your organization. Also keep in mind that a robust validation program doesn't simply end with validating the system. You'll want to consider and address the peripheral supporting procedures, things like change control, backup and restoration, business continuity and disaster recovery, user account management, and also system-specific SOPs. Collectively, the suite of SOPs will encompass your entire validation program. As I mentioned before, your program will be the sum of all of the parts that you will endeavor to create. In addition to an MVP being a methodology, it's also important to remember that it includes people. Without the people that engage in the process, we can't be successful. These individuals will likely vary from system to system, considering the system's use or even complex nature. But they will be contributing members of teams, and they will have their own responsibilities. Typical personnel include subject matter experts, quality assurance, system owners and system administrators, management, and potentially, depending on your organization, they may include committees, either for computer system validation or for change control management. You may consider, when drafting your MVP or your validation program, to list out the roles and responsibilities associated with each stakeholder. Between language included in the regulations and the OECD advisory document, I recommend including the following topics into your program to ensure that your efforts are well considered, well documented, robust, and executed thoroughly. You may want to consider risk assessment, evaluating the likelihood, the probability, and the corresponding severity and impact of potential risks on your system. Validation planning and reporting, and what that looks like on an individual system basis. Requirements management, these are functions that the system must do. You may want to consider collating these requirements into groups as functions, such as hardware and software functions that the system must do, or security or calculation requirements, maybe input and output requirements, user requirements, these types, and regulatory requirements. Those are always very important. These are functions that we need and must have our system do each and every time the system is used. Configuration management, which is akin to how the system is set up. This will include default settings and things like threshold settings. Think of it like setting a threshold for a freezer alarm in an environmental monitoring system, right? If your freezer is set to maintain a temperature between 70 and 80 degrees Celsius, minus 70 and 80 degrees Celsius, but you want the system to alarm if it goes outside those ranges, that would be a configurable element. In testing, and for testing, we use testing to demonstrate that the system operates the way it's supposed to. We've taken our requirements and our configuration and we've transferred that into a script or a list of steps that we need to follow to make sure that our system does perform the way that we've said we need it to, and that those thresholds are set and the alarms do happen when they're supposed to. Your testing may include a path of IQ, OQ, or PQ testing, or IQ and UAT testing, or some combination thereof that's bespoke to your organization. We also want to consider data migration. This is moving data from one system to another, which can occur as part of a validation, a change control, or a retirement. Between the language included in the regulations and the OECD advisory document, I recommend including the following topics. We want to also consider vendor management, which is evaluating your computer system vendors or providers for compliance with the regulations, as well as your own internal business needs. Change management, which is changing the system during use, or it's commonly referred to as change control. Retirement, which is when you're no longer going to be using the system. We want to retire and decommission the system, or retire a system and use another system. Maybe we're going to migrate our data. We also want to include in our program how to handle failures with the system, including compliance with regulatory requirements. If we're not able to achieve that expectation, how are we going to document it and justify it and mitigate it? Leveraging our vendor documentation to support our validation and also our computerized system inventory. So in the case of the laboratory and our case study that we discussed a few slides ago, for this case, testing facility management convened a committee comprised of department heads, quality assurance, and IT, and tasked the committee with developing a right-sized approach to validation. The organization as a whole was comprised of approximately 150 mostly scientific personnel with little to no experience in computer validation. Some of the team members and some of the organization personnel were brand new to even GLP and Part 11 compliance. It was a learning opportunity for many, but it was a great opportunity to unite the departments and work towards a common goal. Every team member brought something unique to the table and contributed positively towards the end goal. Due to their time crunch, they met at least weekly and often for several hours at a time, and engaged in some intensive planning. The committee members, since the validation was new to the organization, this cadre of personnel served to provide continuity between the MVP and the implementation. And so what they decided was that once the MVP was implemented, this committee that helped to develop the validation program would continue to serve on the committee on an ongoing basis for 2 years. The goal for the committee was to develop a process that was neither onerous nor complicated, but rather logical and achievable. To get started and to frame their perspective in a way that was relatable to them and relatable to their experience as scientific personnel working on a GLP study, they generated a few basic questions about validation, and then for point of reference, compared those questions, relatively speaking, to how they would approach a GLP toxicology study. So for example, key questions like, where do we start? How do we know the system works? What documents do we need? And how do we know it's approved? The basic core questions. By walking through the questions, they were able to look at it from a GLP tox study and determine that if it were a tox study, they would start with a protocol. So maybe having a protocol for a validation would be a good thing. Should they have a validation plan or a validation protocol? How they know a study works or how they know that a study meets the objective end goals is on a GLP tox study, they might run some scientific assays or methods or clinical chemistry or some sort of specialized data. In a validation study, they were able to determine that their requirements, their configuration management, their testing, and their objective evidence from testing would be a parallel to those assays and clinical chemistries run on a GLP tox study. In a GLP tox study, they realized that they would need to have raw data, they'd have scientist reports, and they'd have a final study report. And so they drew a parallel to a validation and determined a validation summary report would be an appropriate deliverable. And in the GLP tox study, the study director signs a final report. And so for validation, management would sign the validation summary report and say the system is able to be used. So they were able to create a list of minimum deliverables for validation that would be a parallel to a GLP tox study to kind of frame their minds. The committee focused on some of the challenges of the existing SOP, which made it difficult to follow. So they were able to look and determine those key elements, those key deliverables. They were able to identify specific team members that may be needed on an individual validation basis. They were also able to assess how to handle what happens if a computerized system did not meet the regulatory requirements. They were able to develop some basic acceptance criteria. They were able to develop a process for handling regulatory requirement failures, what types of additional efforts or activities would be done to mitigate those failures, including providing an explanation or a rationale on the impact of those failures. And they were able to lay this SOP out in a manner that was logical and stepwise. The basic sequence of the SOP and the program started from the beginning to the end. So it was stepwise and logical. With the implementation of any new or revised process comes the potential for a myriad of complexities. We hope everything goes well, but occasionally there are some complexities that pop up. So the implementation of an MVP can include several different complexities. Things like stakeholder acceptance, vendor management, or what you might refer to as vendor audits, risk assessment, configuration management, change control or change management, testing styles, and supporting IT processes. Stakeholder acceptance is an important component of every successful validation program implementation. Stakeholder acceptance starts at the very beginning, and in the case of our study and our case study, stakeholder acceptance started when management realized that there was a challenge that needed to be met and informed a committee. And stakeholder acceptance can really make or break an implementation. Being able to appreciate the needs of others and reach across the table and accept their needs and work to address them while being mindful that the intent is not to make the process burdensome is critical. At a high level, key stakeholders include, but certainly aren't limited to management, QA, IT, the archivist, and individual subject matter experts or team members. Each stakeholder will have a different need, and your organization may even have more stakeholders. Stakeholders can also be external to your organization in certain circumstances. For example, in a particular computerized system, perhaps your stakeholders may include your sponsor or your clients. You may find on a particular study or particular endeavor, your sponsor or client has requested that you use a novel technology or a novel system in order to conduct their work. In that case, your client or your sponsor would be a stakeholder. They have a vested interest. In those cases, you want your system-specific validation plan to describe those additional responsibilities, but even more important, you will want to ensure that your master validation program includes how to handle external stakeholders and what is required of those external stakeholders. Consider that all stakeholders have different needs and requirements and may not look alike. Your stakeholder needs may not look like your colleagues' stakeholder needs. Your needs will vary based on perspective, whether it's a program-wide perspective or a system-specific perspective. In a program-wide perspective, stakeholders may be concerned with what's referred to as effort. Effort may be things like time required for training or time required to devote to the actual validation effort. How much time are you going to spend testing? How much time are you going to spend reviewing documents? How much time are you going to spend in deliverable drafting? That's effort. In a system-specific perspective, perhaps the system owner wasn't necessarily focused on effort, like in the program-wide example, but for them, they were looking at how the system was going to work on a day-to-day basis, right? Because that is that particular stakeholder's perspective, that's their need. So they might be looking at things like how the system archives data, or where can they get and see the audit trails? How do they know if the audit trails are complete? How do they make sure that entries are attributable? Are they able to use electronic signatures and how that functionality works? And how many different user roles they can have for a particular system. For example, as a stakeholder, QA will be focused on the verification of regulatory requirements and reconstruction. They will need to understand the process and the documented evidence to be able to verify those components, but they may not need to fully be aware of how to log into a system or how to create a method, but they need to be able to verify that the methods are approved prior to being run. Vendor management is another item for consideration for implementing a program, and the information gained can be extremely valuable as you approach different stages in your process. I always encourage you to approach vendor management for a master validation program in a team-wise fashion. Consider collaborating with members of your quality assurance unit, IT, and your prospective system owners and system users that have the most experience. Sometimes those users that are going to be using the system on a frequent or consistent basis or have the most knowledge may be referred to as a power user. They are excellent members that can contribute to a vendor audit or vendor management endeavor. So collaborating with that team to conduct an audit can widen or expand the amount of material or information that you're able to review when it comes time to conduct the vendor audit. Ideally, a vendor audit is or should be conducted prior to purchasing the system. It can be done after purchase, but prior to purchase gives you an opportunity to provide your audit feedback into the purchasing decision. You may want to consider gathering the audit team prior to the audit and assigning individual focus areas based on your team members' expertise and their experience with using that particular system or a system similar to it. When conducting the audit, try to break down the focus areas and look at processes and supporting documentation that the vendor has. You may want to give careful consideration to things like, does the vendor have experience with the regulations? Sometimes we find that there are systems that are developed and believe that they have all of the required elements to meet Part 11 requirements, but they don't provide enough information in an audit trail. So it's making sure that the vendor has full knowledge and awareness into the regulatory requirements and that their product meets those requirements. You also want to look at what types of SOPs exist and how they're managed and maintained and trained on by personnel, how and where software code is managed and stored, including changes to code and who has access, how changes to their code and their software development lifecycle are managed and documented. Want to pay special consideration to incident management, including patches and bug fixes, and how those incidents are not only assessed and tracked, but how resolution of those incidents are fed back to you as the potential user of the system and how long it takes to get that information from the vendor. You may also want to inquire with the vendor regarding any specific services that are provided only if built into the contract or into their service licensing agreement. Another item for consideration, which adds to a bit of complexity with regards to your validation program and your vendor, is how much of the development and the vendor's own validation activities are handled in-house versus handled by contracted third parties. And if contracted third parties are used, or how are those third parties managed and by whom? Another key item to consider when conducting the vendor audit is looking at the vendor's validation procedures and their documentation, and seeing if it's feasible to work with the vendor to leverage part of their validation and testing efforts to incorporate into your own organization's validation of a computerized system. You can discuss this option during the vendor audit with the vendor and your team. And you want to make sure that your master validation program includes provisions for leveraging those types of documentation and what's required as a part of it. Is there a deeper level of review of that documentation? Does it require management approval or system owner review? Is there going to be a discussion in the master validation plan regarding what documentation you're going to leverage and what the result is? For example, are you going to do less testing because you have the vendor's documents, or are you going to do the same as you would, but you're still going to use those? And lastly, a key area of focus should be what happens if the audit reveals deficiencies with the provider or the vendor's testing. Is the vendor going to be agreeable to conduct additional testing or providing additional documentation to mitigate those gaps? And if not, what on your end are you going to do as an organization to address those deficiencies? So for these reasons, I suggest conducting the audit prior to purchase. It gives you more information about the vendor and their background and their experience and their documentation to contribute towards that purchasing decision. If you're not able to conduct the audit prior to purchase, it becomes even more important to find out these answers, as many of these questions will impact your validation approach and may even require you to conduct additional validation testing or validation activities or risk assessment. While not required by FDA regulation, risk assessment and management is a dynamic tool that can be used in computer validation process and in an MVP. It can be used at various points of validation, from determining how extensive your testing should be to how to handle individual system specific risks, such as lack of a secure archival or lack of an audit trail. OECD advisory document number 17 discusses risk management, and it says that risk management should be applied throughout the life cycle of a computerized system, taking into account the need to ensure data integrity and quality of study results. OECD goes on to further say that risk assessment should be used to develop an adequate validation strategy and to scale your validation efforts. And that validation effort should be driven by intended use of the system and the potential risks. So it makes a logical flow. OECD also states that if your risk assessment outcomes are appropriately used, that they will provide TFM or testing facility management with an adequate methodology to both the validation of simple laboratory systems as well as complex data management systems. Risk assessment and management requires formalization, and by that I mean how you approach risk needs to be written down in an SOP. There are a number of formalized tools that you can use in the process of risk assessment, such as the 5 whys, or an FMEA analysis, or mind mapping or brainstorming, or you can create your own bespoke process for your organization. In the example of our case study, the organization created its own process using a combination of right-sized tools. In a nutshell, there are 3 elements to risk management. The key tenet or element is the identification of risk. This is going to answer the question of what is wrong or What isn't right about the system or what doesn't work, also known as the problem statement, if you will. The next element is the assessment, looking at what the impact of the problem statement is to your data and to your system. And the last major element to risk management is the mitigation, or examining what can be done to reduce, minimize, or hopefully eliminate the outcomes of risk. Mitigations will hopefully involve system-related activities, but in cases, you may need to include procedural or manual controls if there's nothing else that can be done in an automated way with the system. So in the case of our laboratory and our case study, committee meetings during the development of the MVP, the committee strategized on an appropriate program, and committee members decided to include risk assessment in their master validation program, but as a standalone document. What that meant was it was an SOP, a supportive SOP that was developed, and they even created a template to go along with it to help the users document their risk and assess those risks in a logical stepwise format. They were able to describe in detail individual risks and assign a number or color using a stoplight paradigm, if you will, of red, yellow, and green, and a numerical matrix of 1 to 3, where 1 was a low risk and 3 was high for both impact of the risk and the probability of the risk occurring. Once each risk was evaluated for impact and probability, they would be able to develop a scaled approach to their mitigations. A risk that had a potentially low impact and low probability likely involved less mitigation than a risk that had a high impact and a high probability. Scaled mitigations may also include things like depth or degree of required evidence, whether or not to enlist the vendor to create a bug fix or a patch, or even the implementation of management controls. In our case study, the organization also elected to use risk to frame their validation program as a whole. Their risk assessment became a living document which would be updated anytime during the course of the system validation through system retirement, similar to the requirements document or the configuration document, and chose to require that these risks be evaluated for each system, in addition to system level risks. System classification was evaluated to determine if the system was considered a high or a low complexity system. And that would feed into the extent of testing or documentation needed to support requirements. They also assessed the risk of system functions and limitations to develop their testing. They also used risk to assess their sampling strategies. They made their risk assessment process holistic in terms of the development of their MVP and the development of each individual computerized system validation effort. And that allowed them to shape their direction and shape many of the decisions that they made. Configuration management, or how a system is configured, is also very key to validation effort. Identifying those configurations and documenting them will serve in the long run to create a baseline that can be used in the event of an unforeseen incident. Items to consider in configuration management include things like boundaries of the system, the parameters that the system is going to operate within, limits on the amount of data that a system can handle or manage at any one given time, or limits of the system itself, interfaces, operational options, security options, error message options, regulatory requirements. Your configuration management document can be quite extensive depending on the particular system. So it's going to be important to ensure that your program includes that your configuration be documented and controlled, especially if it's going to be used as a part of risk assessment, or if it's going to be used to rely on or as a way to reduce any type of testing activity. Your configuration management document may be managed electronically or on paper, depending on your organization's preference. I've also seen configuration documents or configuration management tools be an export of system settings. Some systems have the ability to export their configuration into a specific file type or into a PDF, or perhaps a mirror image on another system. How your document is structured will depend on the technologies available to you at the time that your program is developed, and will also depend on individual systems. Your testing style or format can be straightforward or based on risk. You may elect to use an IQ, OQ, or PQ approach, or IQ and UAT, or you can utilize risk to create a bespoke testing strategy and evidence that is scaled to meet the needs of your organization. In the case of our laboratory, when the MVP was implemented, one of the first systems to be validated utilized an adaptive testing style. Instead of the traditional IQ, OQ, PQ approach with separate plans for each phase of testing and separate reports for each phase of testing, they chose to go with an integrated IQ UAT approach and then remove the requirement for individual plans and reports and included all of the instruction for testing in their validation plan and all of the results of testing in their validation summary report. They further utilized risk to assign a hierarchy schematic to their requirements. Requirements were rated 1 to 3, 1 for critical, 2 for moderate, 3 for low. And then testing of critical functions was more robustly conducted than it was for moderate or even low risk. And so at the end, they reduced the overall number of test scripts that were required to be completed, but they also reduced the amount of screen captures that were needed and made a switch to a reliance on positive documentation as opposed to creating a screenshot for each step in a test script. Changes happen, and it's not realistic to expect that a system won't change over time. We grow and we change. We're always in a state of constant improvement, and that's the same with a computerized system. So recognizing that it's a continuous part of a system's life cycle and recognizing that we need to include measures to address change is paramount. We want to include and consider things like how changes are documented, what's required from a vendor for a change control, what's required from a system administrator to implement the change, and who approves those changes. In our case study, the committee was created to develop the MVP process, also served again on that 2-year time frame, and part of their duties was to review change controls. So it was comprised of representatives from departments and different sites, and they reviewed all of the changes and documentation for change controls prior to testing and implementation. Due to their diverse nature, they were able to provide insight into potential prospective changes for systems used at multiple sites. They were even able to suggest harmonization efforts and to streamline the use of systems because they were able to see the documentation from the different sites that they had. So this became helpful as they were able to ensure consistency and reproducibility. The committee also implemented a periodic review process along with their change control process. So when it comes to responsible parties, it's important to understand who's responsible for the MVP. At a high level, everyone is responsible for the MVP, similar to how we discussed that each of our stakeholders have different roles and responsibilities. When the MVP is implemented, everybody has a different role and a responsibility for the ongoing maintenance of their system. So management, SMEs, our team members, everybody. IT is an integral part of the development of an MVP for an organization. And so when we talk about supporting IT processes, we recognize that IT are integral to those processes. As we move more and more towards using computerized systems for our organizational needs, we rely on IT to ensure those hardware and infrastructure needs are met. While they may not be subject matter experts on scientific equipment per se, they are subject matter experts at aligning our infrastructure needs and providing technological support when we need it for our particular instrument, for our particular system. They are often our first line on help desk support. They often will aid us as a liaison between a vendor and validation teams to translate system needs and vendor needs for systems into a reality. And we'd be hard pressed to bring on a computerized system without them. There are several key processes to engage IT on with regards to implementing an MVP in your organization that will round out your program. That's going to include backup and restoration to ensure that our data is always backed up and can be recovered and restored when needed. And so IT is going to be integral to assuring and ensuring that that process happens when we need it to happen, and that they know what type of evidence or documentation that we will need in order to verify successful backup and restoration. User access management. This is often managing the granting and withdrawal of user account access. And sometimes that may be, depending on your system, integrated with IT. For example, some user accounts are integrated with Active Directory or single sign-on technologies that are managed at a high level by IT. Disaster recovery and business continuity. IT will be a key party towards ensuring that new systems that come online are included in business continuity and disaster recovery planning and testing. And ensuring that all of our systems are accounted for in that process demonstrates another element of robustness to our systems of checks and balances. As well as electronic archival. Some systems may require IT assistance for archival of electronic data, depending on how they're structured. So ensuring that IT is aware of the regulatory requirements, not only for archival, but how that data, how long that data is maintained is very important. And this person that's going to participate in archival may require specialized training within the system so that they are performing archival as required. As mentioned previously, periodic review is simply a formal process to reviewing your system to make sure they're being maintained in a validated state. Ideally, you want to show some level of documentation assessment, even if your system is undergoing routine changes. For example, you're on a schedule with the vendor to receive quarterly bug fixes or patches. Your MVP should outline the frequency for periodic review for each system also. For example, your organization may wish to conduct periodic reviews every 2 years once the system is placed into use, or more frequently, depending on the criticality of the system to organizational needs. We talked a few slides previously about an inventory. An inventory is management's tool to collating system-wide resources available within the facility. So included on your inventory, we'll want to include things like the system name and version, the name of the system owner, the responsible person for that system once it's placed into use in production, the regulated status, the validated status, the date the system was placed into production use, and the type of system. This inventory should also be reviewed on a periodic basis for accuracy. And that will include things like when a new system comes online, or if a system is retired and therefore goes offline. The inventory, like the risk assessment, is a living document and is subject to a formal documented review process so that you're making sure that the information on it is current. Implementation is key to an effective program. Ensuring that there is not only high-level training, but also focused training for the various roles and responsibilities is vital. Like we said at the beginning, each stakeholder role will have a different vested interest and a different need within the system, and those needs must be provided with training. The FDA regulations require that personnel be trained to conduct their work, so training is a regulatory requirement regardless of the circumstance. Training should include initial training, but also give consideration in your program to the requirement for ongoing or refresher training, not simply when updates or revisions are made to the program or supportive SOPs, but on a periodic and ongoing basis. You'll also want to consider things like how the documentation for the validation effort as a whole will be managed and maintained. Where will it be held? Who's responsible for its maintenance? What's the record retention period? What's the process for requesting the documentation if you're asked for that information by a sponsor or a regulatory authority? In our case study, when the master validation program was implemented, it was implemented as an SOP and it was approved by management. It also included all of the supporting IT documents that we talked about a few slides ago. The committee developed focused training sessions for each individual department and role within a validation. They talked about the overall process, and then as supportive training, they comprised additional training sessions for the specific validation deliverables, requirements document preparation, configuration document preparation, and a series on risk assessment. The committee felt that those documents presented the potential to be challenging for the users, and they wanted to make sure that everybody felt comfortable with the content. The committee also developed templates for the team members to use for a validation so that all of the information was structured and provided in a consistent format. They also participated in committee meetings and offered to review validation deliverables for the project teams. Included on this slide are hyperlinks to the individual references that were discussed at the beginning. You can use these to review the individual documents and as support for the development of your own validation program. I do want to thank you for your time today. We hope, KSQA hopes, that you've learned something new about implementing a master validation process within your organization. My contact information is below. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will be happy to provide any additional information. Thank you.